Revolvers, wheel guns. You guys love them, it seems, from my recollections of the Patreon polls. So that's what we're going to talk about today, some revolver content. The three big categories, says me, of revolvers, where they fit in, where they're useful. With that, welcome to the podcast, where we talk about guns, gun-related stuff, revolvers, the right way, with God Almighty at the center, biblical Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I'm blessed to be your host. First and foremost, I'm a Christian, also military and law enforcement, private security contracting, competition shooting, hunting, and some other stuff. Bio bullet points in the show notes. I am no stranger to revolvers, although they're not my general go-to. I have a lot of experience with them. I carry one off and on for a long time. The first handgun I ever bought with my own money was a revolver. I have used quite a few revolvers. I don't want you to get this mixed up. This is not me giving you my endorsement telling you that your go-to carry gun should be a revolver. It's not. Your go-to carry gun should be a full-size fighting handgun in 9mm. This is my number one recommendation for the vast, vast majority of circumstances. That said, I think revolvers have their place. Some of those places are what I'm going to consider these three categories. The first one is the snub nose revolver. The snub nose revolver, which I'm going to quantify as something you could easily carry in a pocket, something with a barrel of 2 inches or less. The most common of these is the Smith & Wesson J-frame, although not ubiquitous. There is, the Colt Detective Special or the Chief Special, right? They're snub nose. They're modern versions of it. Many, many copies have been made of both of those. The Kimber K6S, they're not all snub noses, but many of those. Right, that size, the Ruger SP 101. All of these are snub nose revolvers, but they all have that kind of pocket ability. Although you can carry them other ways, that is a main advantage of these. Now, there are smaller, lighter guns out there in many cases. However, the revolver has a lot of advantage in the pocket carry. One of them being that they're round. The human body is a lot more round, right? There's not a lot of square, hard edges on a human body. Especially when you talk about where pockets are, right? So the roundness of the revolver, the contours of the revolver, it lends itself well to blending in. Now, these are primarily going to be in .38 Special. Again, not ubiquitous, but the vast majority are going to be in .38 Special. Now, you can get 357/38 Special, and there's a much smaller section of that pie chart in other calibers, right? You've got your 22 long rifle, your 22 Magnum, your 32s, whether, it's a 32 H&R. There's even some really old ones in like 32 Smith & Wesson and things like that. But your 32 H&R, your 32 or your 327 Federal. But these all kind of available in snub nose. And these categories I'm going to give you are not hard and fast, right? There are some crossover. So you could probably nitpick and find one that covers two categories. But these snub nose revolvers, J-frames and others of their ilk, right? They're small, they're handy, they're lightweight. Usually, if we're talking about the 38 or 357, they pack quite a bit of punch for the size, right? They have a lot of firepower for the size and weight that they are. Now, it is a huge myth that revolvers don't jam or malfunction. They certainly do. They certainly do break. And they're very complicated machines. If you ever have had the displeasure of taking apart like a double-action revolver and trying to put it back together, you know how complicated they can be. But that said, they're an old, proven design, and they have a lot of the kinks worked out in them, and they're a fairly closed system, meaning they're fairly hard to, get stuff inside the important parts because they're so closed off and so tight. It can be done, but it's rare. So that lends itself well to pocket carry or other types of carry, or I don't know a better way to put this than they're very forgiving of neglect. Also, I'm talking about double single actions or double action onlys. Those are about as simple a manual of arms as you can get. Now, they're not easy. They're not beginner's guns to shoot well, but they're beginner guns to go bang. And a lot of people, they just want to check that box. And that's why, sadly, I think a lot of these are pawned off on women shooters or things like that. They're like, oh, just point it and pull the trigger. Okay, theoretically, that will make the gun go bang. That doesn't make it easy to hit anything. Snub-nose revolvers are an easy gun to make go bang. They are I would say, a very high-level gun to shoot well. They're one of the harder handguns to shoot well. So just be aware of that. They're not bad guns. They're good guns. I sometimes carry a snub-nose revolver. Not often. I often, most of the time, carry a full-size fighting handgun. But I will often carry a snub-nose. A snub-nose, though, is a much harder gun to shoot. You give me any practical course of fire, it's going to be a lot harder and probably much slower to clean that course of fire with a snub-nose revolver than a proper fighting handgun. So they are kind of an expert's tool for good hardcore use, but they're an easy gun to make go bang. They don't have any manual safeties. Right? They have a long, heavy trigger, so people, this isn't fair, I think, but people are less concerned about safety with them. There's no magazine to lose or anything like that. You know, they're fairly not simple machines, but fairly simple to operate, if that makes sense, and fairly forgiving of neglect. So there's some advantages there. There are also some advantages in CQB and things like that, which I'm not really going to get into on this episode. I've talked about that before. I've done an entire episode on the snub-nose revolver. That's a main category that you may want to consider for those reasons, right? High power to weight ratio in the right caliber, simple, forgiving of neglect, as in simple to operate, and an easy gun to make go bang. Let's put it that way. So those are those. The next one is your fighting revolver, what I'm going to deem a fighting revolver. And this is going to be the most analogous to like a full-size fighting handgun pistol that we would use today. You know, a Beretta 92, a SIG 226, a 1911, even a Glock if you want to slum it, right? A full-size fighting handgun. The crossover to this is going to be your fighting revolver or your duty revolver. This is what was on the hips of our law enforcement for the pretty much almost the entirety of the 20th century. Even when I became a police officer, when I went to work for L.A.P.D, there were cops that still carried a wheel gun, believe it or not. There were still guys on the force carrying a wheel gun. That was still not unheard of. It wasn't common, in the early 2000s, but it was, or the mid 2000s, but it wasn't unheard of either, right? There were still cops carrying revolvers. And for a long time, a mid-size revolver in .38 Special and or .357 Magnum, there were some other calibers, but by far, those were the most common. That's what you would likely find on the hip of a police officer, sheriff's deputy, law enforcement in America in the 20th century and getting into the 21st century. And also saw some military use, but a fighting revolver. And I'm going to quantify this by somewhere around a 4-inch barrel. A 4-inch barrel is not a hard and fast rule, where it could be a 3-inch barrel, it could be a 5-inch, 6-inch barrel, but generally a 4-inch-ish barrel, 4 1/4, somewhere around there. The most iconic of these are the Colt Python. It's like the creme de la creme. But the Smith & Wessons, the Combat Master, the Combat Magnum, right? The 19. There's a bunch of different models, but you probably can visualize or conceptualize what I'm talking about. A mid-size revolver. Now these are much more shootable than a snub-nose revolver. These are usually going to be the most shootable of things that I'm talking about today. If you go back before the 20th century, you would see these in single action, like your old antique, 1873 or, called the Peacemaker, but the 45 Long Colt and things like that, the old cowboy high noon, revolvers. But in the 20th century, you're talking double single action revolvers of that common mid-size, not too heavy to carry all day on your Sam Brown, good shootable, passing police quals with them. In fact, still today, as somebody that's in this world, a lot of the quals that we still have around for federal agencies, local agencies, you'll notice that they can be passed with a revolver. A lot of them don't have more than a 6-round count before reloading because they were around in the days when people carried revolvers. It's kind of sad that we still use those ancient quals, but we still do. That's a legacy of these fighting revolvers. Not so much used at the time. I'm sure they were a little bit, but these came a bit after. But the Ruger, GP 100s, the Security 6s, those would also fit into this category in the appropriate size. Again, these are going to be the most shootable. These can be extremely accurate, especially in like the 38 specials, the target revolvers. These were kind of a mainstay in the bullseye matches. They can be extremely accurate. Fixed sight, fixed barrel. Not all revolvers are accurate. That's a misconception, but they certainly can be extremely, extremely accurate. A good 38 special wad cutter load and in a full size, 4 to 6 inch barrel revolver can be ridiculously accurate for a handgun. They can also be extremely flexible, whereas, a semi-auto, you talk a 9mm, the de facto handgun cartridge of our time. You can shoot a 115 grain fairly fast. You can even shoot a 115 grain plus P, or you can shoot 147 grain, but they all require about the same amount of power because they have to cycle the weapon, whatever semi-auto that is. They have to cycle them reliably, so you need a certain amount of energy. You need enough to cycle the slide, but not enough to break the gun. Revolvers, since you are manually operating that system, you are manually turning that cylinder, whether you're cocking the hammer or pulling the trigger, it's not determined by the power of the cartridge. You can go from super mild, right? As long as that bullet exits that barrel at any kind of velocity, it should not affect the reliability of that gun. You don't need a certain amount of power as long as the bullet exits the barrel. Also, you can go so hot just under the point where you're cracking the frame and causing issues, flame cutting the top strap or something crazy like that. But you can go really, really hot as well, and you will not, as long as the revolver can handle it, affect the reliability of that firearm. You can load it so hot you break it, but other than that, it should be just as reliable. So if we stick with the 38 357, and of course that wasn't the only caliber, there was like the 41 Magnum, very, very small section of that pie chart that was ever used in law enforcement use, but there were other calibers, but by and large it was 38 Special and 357. The vast majority being 38 Special. But you can load really, really mild. If we talk about that, 148 grain soft lead wad cutter, which is a very mild, pleasant load to shoot in a full-size fighting revolver, all the way up into a hot, let's say 125 grain 357. Or heck, if we want to go hot, we could go all the way to 180 grain hard cast 357. And that would bring us into the realm of handgun hunting. This full-size fighting handgun is probably the most flexible of handguns. Full-size fighting revolver. I'm not saying it's as good for combat as a semi-auto. It's certainly not. That's why cops don't carry them anymore. That's why really nobody carries them anymore for any serious duty use. But they are the most flexible. They are flexible as far as being a better hunting tool in general. Not that you can't hunt with a semi-auto. I certainly do and have. And you have the 10mm. But honestly, as far as flexibility goes, a good full-size revolver in 38 357 is super flexible because of that, because you can go down, way down into, powder puff 38 loads all the way up into hardcore, 180 grain hard cast loads. So it's a very flexible platform. You can also choose double single, whether you want to shoot a double action or single action, right? Most of these handguns that I'm talking about when you put them in single action, meaning you cock the hammer, they have a wonderful, wonderful trigger pull. One of the few handguns that beats a 1911 if it's done right, because it's single action only, like a 1911, but it generally has less pre-travel or post-travel because it's just the nature of the system. So one of the best triggers you can get on a handgun will be on one of these type of revolvers. And again, that's going to be your fighting revolver. The last one I'm going to talk about for modern revolvers is going to be your big bore. Again, we go ancient. There were some old school big bore revolvers, but I'm talking like modern big bore revolvers. These primarily are used, if I'm being honest, for guys that just want to shoot big, heavy recoiling handguns because they like it. They're also useful for handgun hunting, and they are useful for bear defense if you want to lug one around. I have a 454 Casull. Common ones of these would be your Ruger Redhawks and Super Redhawks, your Smith & Wesson Model 29s. Yes, and I know that Dirty Harry was a cop that carried a 44 Magnum, but newsflash, that's a movie, that's not real. I'm sure somewhere at some point, some deputy somewhere probably carried a big bore revolver for duty use. I'm not aware of any. I never met any. That's a Hollywood thing. But that was the Smith & Wesson Model 29. I believe that was the first handgun available in 44 Magnum. 44 Magnum, and there is the Colt Anaconda and the Colt Kodiaks. And many others, but those are the big ones, right? But I'm going to consider big bore revolver starting in the 44 Magnum. But 44 Magnum, modern, not the ancient, but modern hot-loaded 45 Colt, 44 Magnum, 454 Casull. You could argue whether 41 Magnum is a big bore or a mid bore. It's so uncommon that it's probably not worth even talking about very much. Good caliber, just never really caught on. But again, these are mostly used for handgun hunting, bear defense, or just because you want to shoot a big, heavy revolver. A lot of people, since they have these for hunting, the single actions are also still popular in these, and there are a lot of modern single actions, like the Ruger Blackhawks, or the Freedom Arms, in these heavy-hitting cartridges. Because if you're hunting, you're not double tapping, so not really a concern. Now, stepping back, you certainly can hunt, and many people do, with a 357 Magnum. It's a phenomenal medium game hunting, and even larger hunting cartridge. And you could certainly do that. Again, that's why it's one of the most flexible. But a lot of people that want a handgun hunt or have one for bear defense, they will generally choose a big bore revolver. Now, there are even bigger. There are the 460, there's the 460 and the 500 Smith & Wesson. There's also the 480 Ruger, although that's very uncommon. But I don't really consider those because the 460, if you've ever handled like a Smith & Wesson X-frame, they're so big as to be comical. They're kind of handguns in name only. They're so big they're generally not used like a traditional handgun. They have like a lot of people put a sling on them and shoot them off a bipod, which at that point, I don't really understand what you're doing. You're just for the fun of it, I guess. But if you're not shooting them like a traditional handgun, that kind of takes the fun out of it for me. But they do exist. Just know that they exist. One of the reasons I chose a 454, for many reasons, but one of those was I could get it in a Ruger Super Redhawk, what I would consider a very large but still handgun-sized handgun. I mean, I can carry it in a holster. I can shoot it like a handgun. I can hold it up and shoot it off my back legs, right? Standing offhand, traditional, handgun shooting techniques. So, but probably the most common sense one of these is a 44 Magnum. And a good 44 mag load, whether you're talking, a 240 grain or up to a 300 and something grain, there's nothing on planet Earth that you can't take with a 44 Magnum. They're going to be the most common of the big bores, and I don't think you'd ever be undergunned on this continent with a .44 Magnum. And it just dawned on me, the Taurus Raging Hunter. The Taurus, pretty much every category that I've mentioned, Taurus or Rossi has made a revolver for those, and those are generally considered the budget versions of the Smith & Wesson and Colts, and a lot of times they're fairly similar copies of one of those designs. Anyway, those are what I would consider the three main categories of modern revolvers. Hopefully this was helpful. I know you guys like your revolver content, so here you go. Maybe if you're looking at getting your first revolver or just want to know more about revolvers, this episode was helpful. A few side notes. The Ruger revolvers are generally known for being a good value. They're also, if you hand load, they're also known for being able to handle some very hot loads. You have to check and make sure that your model is and that they're not all that way. But if you hand load and you like loading hot, there are even reloading manuals that will list special loads just for Rugers. So that's something to be aware of. Also, Ruger makes a lot of guns in stainless. Another side note, it used to be that Rossi's quality control was known for being really poor. I don't think that's the case anymore. One of the patrons sent me a revolver and I shot it a bit, and it seemed pretty decent actually. So I think the newer Taurus revolvers actually are probably pretty decent quality, and they're likely going to be a good value as well. Colt is still has started again making their revolvers and have for years, and I hear good things about them. I hear that they're, as far as functionality goes, every bit as good as the old ones. They might not have the collectability or, the fine finish or whatever, but as far as function goes, they seem to be just fine. So if you want a Colt Python or Anaconda or Kodiak, those are still being made. They're not cheap, but the originals weren't cheap. Right? They were always like the creme de la creme of the, revolver world. Also, if you want to get into reloading, the 38 Special is, if you have a 38 Special, that's going to be my place I'm going to tell you to probably start. It's one of the easiest cartridges to reload for. With the caveat of the case is way bigger than it needs to be, so you could easily double or triple charge a case. However, if you inspect the powder charge, which you should be, not a big deal, but they are very easy, straight-walled case, very flexible as far as different loads you can load for it. So if you're looking to get into reloading, a revolver and a 38 Special will be a good place to start. Your tactical tip of the day: bore snakes are generally a good idea all the time, but a revolver can be quite hard to clean from the breech with a traditional cleaning rod. If you're really careful, you can clean them from the muzzle, although it's generally, I don't recommend that you clean anything from the muzzle end. You should clean your barrel in the direction the bullet travels. So just an easy way to do that is just with a bore snake. And with a revolver, unless you're getting some really, wicked leading in the barrel, you should be fine with just a bore snake. So you want to have one of those around in general, but for the revolver, you can pull it through the cylinder. The cylinders, that's not the right term. You can pull it through each one of the cartridge holes in the cylinder, and you can pull it through the barrel instead of potentially damaging your barrel by trying to shove a cleaning rod down the muzzle. Oh, I should give you another tactical tip of the day, too. I guess this is a thing that, a lot of people, especially that, have grown up shooting Glocks, their trigger is so bad on a Glock, the staging of the trigger and the shooting to reset is a technique. It's not a good technique. I don't advise you shooting that technique anytime, even if you're shooting a Glock. Yeah, I know how to do it. I know how it works. I've trained in it extensively. I think it's a worthless technique. But the point of that for today is it can really get you into trouble if you try that technique on a revolver. You can seize up the cylinder. When you're shooting a revolver, a double action, single action revolver, when you pull the trigger, all the way out, all the way in, all the way out, all the way in. If you try and shoot it like a Glock and stage a trigger, shoot to reset, you could very easily cause a malfunction. Again, revolvers do malfunction. So don't do that. All the way out and all the way in. With that, that's going to bring us to the tactical verse of the day. whatever weapon you use, this is a fantastic, fantastic verse. You shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall by the sword before you. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you. For I will look on you favorably, and make you fruitful, and multiply you, and confirm my covenant with you. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.